Hello, everyone. Thank you for a great, engaging start to the second annual Political Analytics Conference. My name is Jordan Schmidt, and I graduated from the Political Analytics program in December. Thank you. I recently accepted a position as a research analyst at New River Strategies, a data analytics firm, as they start to build their polling division. Last year, I attended this conference as a student, and it is hard not to reflect on how much this program has allowed me to grow in my professional confidence and my technical skill set. My early career wins are due to my experience as a political analytics student. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Jennifer Agiesta, Director of Polling and Election Analytics at CNN. Jennifer leads the network's polling team, which both conducts and reports on polling and heads its election night decision desk. Jennifer is recognized as a leader in public opinion and survey research and served as president of the American Association for Public Opinion Research from 2023 to 2024. Prior to joining CNN, she served as director of polling at the Associated Press. She has also covered polling at the Washington Post and helped build the National Election Pool exit poll operation at Edison Research. Please join me in a round of applause as I pass it over to Jennifer.
Hello. Nice to be back up here. We've heard a few times here about how people started their careers. I've been in polling for about 25 years now. And polling during that time has shifted really dramatically. It's changed in terms of how it's used, in terms of the methods that are a part of poll data collection. And as we've heard a few times during this conference, there are lots of questions about the future of the field. And so what I'm going to do is walk through a little bit of polling's past, as well as what we can learn from it now. So a little bit of polling history. Polling on elections has been around for about 200 years. In the 1824 US election, that was sort of the first time that we saw people who were interested in political opinions go out there to like specific events and figure out the preferences of people at those events and try to treat that as a marker of what the broader public would think. Obviously, that wasn't very scientific. The methods evolved over time. We eventually got to the point where there were some early notable failures, unfortunately. Literary Digest and Dewey Defeats Truman, which a lot of people have heard about. Those were really methodological issues continued, right? They made some weird choices on sampling, and that resulted in results that were not so great. More modern methods evolved after that and became refined. And we wound up in a point where in the late 20th century, there were RDD telephone sampling was cheap. It was easy, it was fast, we could do kind of anything we wanted to do with it, and we went a little bit crazy. So I'm going to pick a little bit on my colleagues, predecessors really, at CNN and Gallup with a few of their fun findings. In October 2000, they polled on the important question of whether a young woman today would prefer a handsome or a wealthy mate. In 1999 and 1997, they really dug into the paranormal. I would note that the belief in witches at 22%, that's up from 11% in 1978. And most importantly, how confident are you that you could change a flat tire on a car? Notably, 92% of men, very confident. 38% of women were very confident. And whether that reflects reality, I don't think we have a good benchmark for that. But we don't really have the capacity for that kind of thing anymore. Polling is so much more expensive, as you heard from our first panel this morning. It costs a lot of money to really get a representative sample because people just communicate in different ways than they did in 1978 when everybody answered their telephone when it rang at dinner. Polling takes more time. It's harder to do, and it requires a lot more expert knowledge. You can't just randomly stratify your RDD sample by geography and expect miracles. You really have to do a lot more work on the sampling end and on the weighting end to know who you're talking to and who you're not to understand what you're looking at when you get your data at the end. There is, as a fun caveat, polling that doesn't necessarily require all of that, but it's called the same thing in the media and in the public. And so the consumers of data don't always know the difference between polling and polling, right? And it's our job to kind of tell them what that is. Over the last 25 years, polling as an industry has changed dramatically. And this is from a Pew Research Center chart or study of the methodologies used by public pollsters. It's a little bit tricky to read, but it is well worth your time to look at this chart. The two notable things here are that the dark blue area at the bottom, that's the percentage of pollsters who are using RDD telephone methodologies with live interviewers. As you can see in 2000, that was absolutely the dominant method of doing survey research. And in 2022, when Pew released these data, 4% of pollsters were using live phone RDD methodology. And I suspect if you update these numbers for 2024, it is much smaller. Public pollsters just aren't going that route because it's lost all of its efficiency. What you do see is that big orange chunk in the middle. That's people who are exclusively using online opt-in methods to do their surveys. That could be almost anything. I don't think Pew really differentiated here between people who are using non-probability panels that are really well maintained, like YouGov or Ipsos, and people who are just kind of doing convenient samples that they got on Facebook. So this is like a huge array of ways that polls can be conducted, but the language we have to talk about it is still just polling. As I was doing my research for my APOR presidential address last year, I came across this quote from Andy Kohut that it remains one of my favorite things about polling. He said, in 1995, all of us have our own examples and anecdotes about the way pollsters are portrayed in the popular culture, either as manipulators themselves or as advisors to weak officials. And during an election period, talk to civic groups or just plain folks about polling and feel the vibes. They are not very good. When I first started giving such talks, people would ask me how we do it. Now they ask why we do it. Not a lot has changed since 1995 and how people think about pollsters. All of the things that Andy said are still true. I can only answer the question of why I do it for myself. But as a journalist, doing polling is a critical element of our political coverage and really the only way we have to bring the voice of the American public into what we tell the world is happening in America. I see four main roles for polling in the public conversation around politics. And to get at Michael's point this morning about relying on vibes a little bit, polling can be used to reach across polarization. We've talked so much in the last few years in the political world about how polarized the American public is. And I've looked at this a few different ways, and this I think is my preferred way to do it. So what I did here, I took the county level vote results from the 2020 election, and I sorted them from most Democratic to least. And each of these bars reflects the margin in roughly the top 20% most Democratic, next most, et cetera, breaking it down by quintiles of the electorate, so 20% of voters who live in counties that are super Democratic. Joe Biden won that group by 50 points. Donald Trump won that bottom group of the most Republican places in the country by 44 points. So that is a 94-point gap in the margin between the most Democratic and the most Republican places. In the year 2000, when George W. Bush and Al Gore faced off in the closest contest that we've had in a very long time, it was a little bit different. The gap between the most Democratic and the most Republican places was more like 70 points. So that's like a big shift in polarization over that time. And then when you add 2024 to the mix, what you see here is that the most Republican places became even more Republican than they were in 2020, which makes sense. Donald Trump won this time. But in those most Democratic places, Kamala Harris won those by 43 points, roughly. So a smaller margin than Joe Biden did. That's still about a 90-point swing from those very Democratic places to those very Republican places. Another way to look at this is the count of the counties that were closely decided. In 2000, 812 counties across the U.S. out of more than 3,100 were decided by less than 10 points, so single-digit margins. And there were 404 in 2000 that were decided by less than 5 points. In the 2024 election, there were only 304 counties that were decided by a single-digit margin. And there were only 156 decided by less than 5 points. That's a very small segment of the population that's living in a place where they would be interacting with people with different political views on a regular basis. It's not very many people. Polling can help to tell the story of what's happening in politics across those lines. It also provides a voice for people. It is the only scientific way we have to get a read on what the entire public thinks. It ensures that the only voices we're hearing are not just the ones that are the loudest, right? That can happen a lot in politics. The people who have the money, the people who have the access, the people who have the ability to speak up are the ones that we hear. But with polling, you can reach the people who can't access those venues. It also reveals hard-to-see truth and helps to find change. Without polls, we would not have known going into the 2016 election that there was an emerging educational divide in the American public. We also would not have seen in 2020 the way that coronavirus became a politicized issue for public health. We would not have seen in 2024 that Black and Latino voters were starting to be more open to the idea of voting for Donald Trump. All of those storylines that were integral to American politics in the last 8 years came from polling. And finally, as Molly and Wes both mentioned in our earlier panel, we talk a lot about the horse race. It's a thing that lots of people focus on. But the other pieces of what we do as pollsters really help to tell the story of an election. They put the stakes of that horse race number in context. And you can't really understand what happened in any given election without that. So I'm going to walk through some highlights from last year's election of stuff that we knew because of polling. So I'm going to start in March of 2023. This was about a year out from when the primaries would get going. And the American public at this point was in a very no thank you place about the frontrunners in each of the parties' elections. What you see here are the results of our question. This is not really a horse race. Who do you think the Democratic Party should nominate as the party's candidate for president in 2024? Joe Biden or someone else? And then the same thing on the Republican side, Donald Trump or someone else. That was the choice that they were given. And you can see that in both parties, this was not a runaway, super popular support for either of these guys, right? Like the partisans themselves were divided. What you see on the blue side is a result among Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents, and then on the red side among Republicans, Republican-leaning independents. Within these two buckets, on the Democratic side, only 33% of Democratic-aligned people younger than age 45 wanted Biden to be the party's nominee, compared with 51% who were 45 or older. On the Republican side, the key division there was education. 34% of Republican and Republican-leaning individuals with college degrees wanted Donald Trump to be the nominee. Among those without college degrees, that was 63%. And there were similar divides within the Republican Party by self-identified political affiliation, independents who leaned versus self-identified Republicans, and by ideology between moderates and conservatives. We move forward to November 2023, 1 year out from Election Day. Joe Biden's approval rating was 39%. Donald Trump's favorability rating was 38%. The share satisfied with the candidates they had to choose from was 50%. 72% said things were going pretty or very badly in the United States. And 92% said that the economy would be extremely or very important to their vote. On that candidate satisfaction number, by age, 56% of those younger than 45 said they were dissatisfied with their choices. Among those who were older, 54% were satisfied. That was concentrated among Democrats. 2/3 of younger Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents said they were dissatisfied with their choices. Among pure independents, people who don't lean toward either party, 81%, 1 year out from the election, said they were dissatisfied with the choices they had for president. We move forward a couple of months to January. Biden and Trump were still pretty unpopular. Trump's favorability rating was 39%, Biden's was 34%. And we had this question about whether each party would have a better chance of winning in the 2024 election if their nominee was Biden or someone else, or Trump or someone else. And this is among their own partisans, again. What you see here is that Republicans are starting to unify around Trump, clearly. 72% of them think they have a better shot at winning with Trump as the nominee. Democrats, not so much. They're still pretty divided on Joe Biden. And the age gap persists here. Younger Democrats, 39%, thought they had a better chance with Biden versus 52% among those age 45 or older. On the GOP side, those college grads who had been sort of not so sure about Trump previously, white college graduates within the Republican Party, 57% of them at this point thought they had a better chance to win with Trump than with someone else. So the dynamic within parties was changing. We move on through the primaries. Both Biden and Trump lock up their party's nominations pretty quickly. By March, we were set. We had our delegate locked in. We were ready to go. Joe Biden's approval rating, still 40%. Donald Trump's favorability rating, 37%. The share satisfied with the candidates they had to choose from, 47%. No better than it was before. The share saying the economy would be important to their vote, 92%, also the same as it was before. And we start to see this division in backward-looking views of Biden and Trump as president. In our April survey in 2024, 61% of Americans said that Biden's presidency to that point had been a failure. At the same time, 55% said they saw Trump's presidency as a success. We also had the finding that 76% of voters who said they supported Donald Trump at that time said they would continue to do so even if he was convicted of a crime. So you have the groundwork being laid in the spring for a Trump advantage. Extremely negative views of Joe Biden, a loyal base for Trump, and a backward-looking positive view of his time as president. We move forward to June. The debate comes around, and we revisited this question of whether your party would have a better chance with your current nominee or someone else. The Republican side belief that Trump was their best shot continued to grow. And there's very little gap between non-college and college white voters within the Republican Party here. 86% of white non-college Republicans said they'd have a better shot with Trump. That was 71% among those without college degrees. So that had continued to grow for that group. On the Democratic side, however, the share of younger Democrats who said the party would have a better shot with Biden dropped to 31 points. That's down 8 points from the last version of this that I showed you. Whereas among the Democrats older than 45, 49% said that they would have a better shot with Biden. That's statistically unchanged from where they were previously. July, Biden drops out. 87% approve of his decision to end his campaign. 76% of Democrats and Democratic-leaning independent voters say Harris should be the nominee. At the same time, 47% of Democrats and Democratic-leaning independent voters, Democrats, with a sitting Democratic president, say the next Democratic nominee should take the country in a new direction rather than continue Biden's policies. There's like a clear rejection of Joe Biden throughout these data consistently for almost 2 years. Our horse race at this point was 49 Trump, 46 Harris. That was within the margin of error for a poll, no clear leader. But the big change here for Harris is that half of her backers said that their choice was to support her rather than to oppose Trump. Biden's high point on that number previously had been 37%. So this was a moment of change for the Democratic electorate. After Labor Day, though, it became very clear that we were looking at an extremely close race. Our final national polling, our late state polling, all of it really pointed to a very close contest that either candidate can win. But the fundamental measures of public opinion, the things that we look at in an election year, all typically pointed to a bit of an edge for Trump. Biden's approval rating remained at 37% among likely voters, which when you're trying to get your sitting vice president elected is probably not great. 68% of registered voters said things in the country were going badly. That was worse than for any incumbent party seeking re-election since 1980 in CNN and Gallup data. 49% of voters said their financial situation was worse than a year ago. And Trump had a wide edge as more trusted to handle the economy. And we all know how this played out in the end. The signs were there in the polling, even with an extremely close race, that the sort of natural advantages were on the Republican side. Moving forward, it's not totally clear that Donald Trump has picked up on the lesson of what all that polling told us. We have one issue on American voters' minds, and it is the economy. CNN has, since the inauguration, had multiple polls showing that a majority of Americans say Trump does not have the right priorities. He's not focusing on the right issues. And the thing that they are focused on is the economy. There are early signs that Donald Trump's gains within the youth and Latino vote are not holding. In December, during the transition, 51% of Americans aged 18 to 34 said they approved of the way that Trump was handling the transition, and 60% said they had confidence in him to handle the economy. Among Hispanic voters, or Hispanic Americans, that was 53% approved of his handling of the transition, and 72% said they had confidence in him to handle the economy. By March, shortly after his address to Congress, only 39% of young people approved of the way he was actually handling the presidency. That was 12 points lower than his transition approval. And 41% approved of the way he was handling the economy. Obviously a slightly different question, but almost 20 points lower than the share who had said they had confidence in him as recently as December. Among Hispanics, 35% said they approved of his handling of the presidency generally. That's 18 points lower than the approval for his handling of the transition. And 33% said they approved of his handling of the economy, almost 40 points lower than the share that said they had confidence in him to handle the economy before he took office. There are some methodological things to look for and other questions that aren't directly about Trump, but that feels like the early indicator of something to watch to see where public opinion on him is going. Are there any differences in polls based on waiting to recalled vote? This was a huge conversation within the 2020 election, whether that was the right thing to do or not. There were some polls early on in Trump's term that were waiting to recalled vote and had slightly higher approval ratings for him. And I wonder if that will hold going forward. It could be other methodological differences, but that's one that we'll be watching as pollsters. I think we should watch where partisanship goes in a moment where views of Democrats are so deeply dissatisfied. In our most recent polling, Democratic Party favorables were at their lowest point ever in CNN polling. That goes back about 30 years. We have 52% saying, within the Democratic Party, saying that their leaders are taking the party in the wrong direction. And 57% said that they want Democrats in Washington to stop the Republican agenda. In 2017, just after Trump took office, that was completely the opposite. Democrats wanted their leaders to work with the Republican Party to get their ideas enacted in law in whatever way possible. But the position of the lay Democratic Party right now is not that. They want action against the Republican agenda. And I think it's notable that we're in a moment where so many markers of public opinion just don't move. We saw this with Trump's first term, and we saw it in Biden's term, that approval ratings tend to settle at a level and they just kind of hold there. We see it with things like right direction, wrong track. It just doesn't move very much. Views of the economy, they're just not really moving. So do these indicators of public opinion start to move, or do we remain in a moment in which entrenched partisan opinions drive what we're seeing in the polls? And how do we figure out what the next markers are? So that's my take on where we are right now in the political moment, and I'd be happy to take your questions. If you need a card, raise your hand. Okay. Thank you very much. Was there any difference in support for Harris before and after Biden's endorsement? Well, she wasn't really running before the endorsement, so I don't really have a good measure on that. We did find in late June that among a range of Democrats that we tested against Donald Trump, that she performed better than others. But I don't know that her number within that matchup necessarily moved pre versus post. Thank you. You mentioned the approval rating for Trump going down. What role does approval rating play outside of election years? That's a great question. It is a thing that we track throughout the presidential term. And I think it's notable and meaningful in terms of the amount of political capital that a candidate has, or that's how it's been treated in the past. Whether that is still true is a bit of an open question. I think if his numbers remain particularly strong within the Republican Party, among Republicans, among the people who might be voting in primaries to determine whether senators and congresspeople get to keep their seats in 2026, then given Republican control of both chambers of Congress, he probably would have more sway even if his overall number comes down. So it really depends on that partisan makeup, I think, of how that plays out. This is more of a thought. Trump said that key issues for his victory were illegal immigration and trans and women's sports. You said it is the economy. I think it is absolutely the economy. His voters were very focused on the economy as the top issue, and I think that there is scads of data that show that the most important issue for most Americans right now is the economy, that people are concerned about inflation, that is the thing that's driving it. Dissatisfaction with the previous administration's handling of that drove quite a lot of this. Oh my gosh, any questions? Okay, thank you. Does public opinion ever suddenly move in response to specific events, and do these changes tend to persist or revert? I think that depends dramatically on what issue we're talking about. We've certainly seen less of it in recent years than we did previously. That's part of why I said watching approval rating is kind of important. It used to, if you look at Gallup's Job Approval Center, you can see their trend line for presidents going all the way back, I think, to Truman. And those numbers do tend to fluctuate quite a lot up until you get to really the first Trump presidency. And then they kind of flatline and they don't move very much. And that was true also for Biden after Afghanistan. The withdrawal from Afghanistan certainly moved Biden's approval rating numbers, but then they never moved from that. They really stayed pretty persistently negative from that point forward. I think you see this within polling around issues like gun control. When there's been a major event or a mass shooting of some kind, there tends to be a spike in salience around gun issues and some shifting in public opinion on the merits of the issue, policies around the issue. But then it often does revert back to where it was before. It hasn't really persistently stayed one way or the other throughout that time. And I think I probably can do one more. So I'm going to take this one. Are you polling for the 2028 Dem candidate, and who do you think? So the answer is no. I am not polling on that because it is way too early. Way too early. There is so much that will happen and can happen between now and the 2028 presidential primaries that any measure taken now would be a little silly. We were talking within our newsroom recently about some stuff that we had produced at CNN around the 2016 election that I think was produced probably early in 2015 or maybe late in 2014. And we're looking at it and it's got all these faces on it. And we're like, where's Donald Trump? He wasn't there because he wasn't running for president yet. And the man wound up president in 2016. So if you start polling too early, there is a high likelihood that you are going to be way off the mark. We can ask President Giuliani about that. We can ask President Jeb Bush about that. So no, we're not there yet. Patience.